Hello, I'm Jan. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Remember when Russia was leaving Syria? Well, surprise, they're back. But this time not to save Bashar al-Assad. No, as far as we know, he's living in exile in Moscow. Instead, Vladimir Putin is cozying up to the very rebels he once bombed. Because in the Middle East, there are no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent air bases, apparently. For Moscow, Syria remains a symbol of endurance, proof that even with depleted resources, global influence is a game Russia refuses to quit. And what is Moscow in the eyes of the new rulers in Damascus? Well, let's take a look at our latest report to find out.
Russia is reopening its Syrian chapter, but this time without Bashar al-Assad. A high-level delegation led by Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak landed in Damascus unannounced, signaling Moscow's bid to turn the page with Syria's new leadership after Assad's ouster last year. Energy, bases and reconstruction, the pillars of the old alliance, are now being renegotiated. For years, Russia dominated Syria's war economy. Its troops guarded the regime, its oil-filled Syrian tanks and its bases in Tartus and Main anchored its presence in the Mediterranean. Now, Damascus wants cheaper fuel and reconstruction aid in exchange for continued access to those same facilities. A once one-sided alliance has become transactional, and Syria, for the first time in a decade, has leverage. The talks went beyond energy. Novak arrived with generals and diplomats to discuss base rights, military training and a renewed commitment to work with the OPCW. A part of Syria's effort to distance itself from Assad's toxic legacy and re-enter global diplomacy. A day before the visit, Israeli jets struck Syrian targets, a reminder of how fragile Damascus remains. Moscow condemned the raids and cast itself as a stabilizer, though its influence in the region is clearly waning. For Russia, the goal is to stay indispensable. For Syria, it's to reclaim sovereignty without losing support. A fragile new page, written in oil, bases and survival.
And now, let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. 10 years ago, Vladimir Putin ordered Russia's first large-scale military operation beyond its borders since the Soviet era. The intervention in Syria not only saved Bashar al-Assad's regime, it redefined Moscow's global role.
When Syria's civil war erupted in 2011, Moscow backed Assad diplomatically and supplied weapons but stayed out of the fighting. By 2015, Assad was losing ground fast. On September 30th that year, Russia stepped in with airstrikes, special forces and military advisors, claiming to fight ISIS, but in reality targeting opposition forces threatening the regime. The campaign turned the tide. Russian air power helped Assad regain control of major cities from Aleppo to Palmyra. In the years that followed, Moscow built an extensive network of nearly 90 military facilities across Syria, giving it permanent reach across the Middle East. Assad's survival made him indebted to Putin. Russia became Syria's main military and diplomatic patron, brokering truces, steering UN talks, and sidelining Western influence. But dependence bred friction over reconstruction funds, Iran's growing sway, and Moscow's desire for political reform in Damascus. Even a decade on, Syria remains the model for Russia's intervention strategy. Fast, ruthless and decisive, meant to prove that Moscow protects its allies when the West hesitates.
And now we're zooming in on Damascus and Moscow to explore the issue in greater detail. For years, Syria was the stage on which Russia displayed its global ambitions, a proving ground for its air force, a bargaining chip with the West, and a place to test out shiny new ways of flattening cities. But by 2023, as Russia's war in Ukraine dragged on, Moscow quietly packed up much of its Syrian deployment, leaving behind only the bare minimum to guard its naval base in Tartus and its airbase in Khmeimim. The message seemed clear. The Kremlin had bigger fires to fight. Now, fast forward to the 31st of July 2025. Syria's new foreign minister walks into the Kremlin, carrying an unexpected offer, an invitation for Russia to come back. The trick was they wanted Moscow not to occupy or dominate, but to patrol Syria's southern border with Israel. The logic? Russia's return could prevent Israel's interference in Syrian affairs. The same rebels who once cursed Moscow's bombs now want its boots back on their soil, apparently. And so, in one of the most surreal diplomatic reversals in recent memory, Russia, the power that abandoned Assad, is now being courted by his successors. And yet Moscow's recognition of Syria's new government isn't driven by affection, but by cold strategic calculus. Russia's Middle East policy has always been built on a simple principle: keep a foothold no matter who's in charge. ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, those remain terrorist organizations in Russian law. But Hamas, Hezbollah, not so much. The Taliban recently taken off the list entirely. And while new President al-Jilani's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham organization still carries the terrorist label, Moscow's diplomats don't seem to mind. The naval port at Tartus and the Khmeimim air base are Russia's Mediterranean lifelines, essential for projecting power into Africa, the Red Sea and beyond. They're not just symbolic outposts, they are the arteries that connect Russia's military presence from Libya to the Central African Republic. At first glance, Damascus shouldn't need Russia. The new government is awash in Gulf money, reconstruction deals and Western overtures. After years of isolation, Syria is being welcomed back into the regional fold. But beneath the normalization lies a set of hard realities: drought, hunger, fragmented security forces, and a fragile social fabric. 16 million Syrians still face food insecurity, and the army remains a patchwork of militias. For Syria, inviting Russia back is both an insurance policy and a hedge, protection from neighbors like Turkey and Israel, and a reminder to Gulf donors that Damascus still has other options. Putin's Syria strategy may look contradictory: backing former rebels, flattering Israel, outmaneuvering Turkey, but that's the whole point. It's about leverage, because in this region, if you're not in the room, you're the topic of conversation. And Vladimir Putin, he always makes sure he's still in the room. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Łukasz Fiderek, director of the Institute of the Middle East and Far East at the Jagiellonian University. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello and good morning.
So Moscow's rapprochement with Damascus, do you think it's temporary, or perhaps does it have more long-lasting prospects?
Well, I think that the moves towards more of a long-lasting one. The relationship is being reconstructed since at least summer. In July, we had a high-profile visit of Syrian authorities, delegation led by Foreign Minister Shaibani to Moscow, and that particular visit seems to restart the bilateral relationship, and both sides are trying to find a sort of acceptable new balance, new trajectory of that relationship, taking into account many difficult issues dividing both sides, but taking into account also a number of common interests between those two governments.
So now, these common interests, let's just clarify, these are not necessarily between the Syrian people and Russia, but between the current government and Russia, right? Can you, provide us with some examples there? Because obviously what most people do remember is that following the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime, the new government wanted to get rid of the Russians. So all of a sudden, they're on speaking terms once again. Why is that so?
Well, definitely the sentiment among the opposition supporters in Syria was anti-Russian. It was not as strong as anti-Iranian one, but people of Aleppo, people of Homs, they do remember Russian planes bombarding their houses, hospitals, etc. All kind of atrocities which were done by the Syrian Arab army with the support of Russian logistics, supplies, munition supplies, so-called advisors, and so on and so forth. So probably the sentiment is among the population. We cannot measure it, obviously, because it's still quite difficult to conduct polls in Syria, but the sentiment is not very favorable towards Russia, at least among the, let's say, majority of Sunni population. But Syria is a country which is sort of fragmented, and there are a lot of minorities. Should you go and ask the coastal communities comprising mostly of Alawites, namely the sect of the deposed president Bashar al-Assad, then probably the sentiment would differ. Some people in the coast, they perceive Russian presence there, and let's us remind that Russians, they do have two large military installations in the Syrian coast, namely the Khmeimim air base and the Tartus naval base. So some people in the coast would probably prefer to have Russians' presence there, perceiving Russians' presence as a sort of a shield against the central government in Damascus. Having said that, we must agree that, well, majority of Syrians probably would prefer not to have too close relations with Russia. But then, as you hinted, is the government.
Yes, the government is terrified of what Israel could do, because Israel is actually on a roll. Israel is fighting against all of its perceived enemies in the region, Iran, Hamas, and there were quite recently actually air raids in the Syrian territory as well, carried out against the government. So would you say that Israel's activity is kind of pushing the government to align itself with Russia once again?
Yes, here you've outlined it very, very clearly. That's the crucial point for the government. Government is using their ties with Russia or trying to rebuild them in order to counterbalance the Israeli threat. Despite the fact that, in the last years of Bashar al-Assad rule, Russia was not very keen to actively oppose Israeli encroachments into Syrian airspace, but nevertheless, the presence of Russian forces, at least to some extent, limited the freedom of movement of Israeli airplanes, warplanes in the Syrian airspace. And that is something which Syrian government is very serious about, because for them, it is a hugely, potentially destabilizing issue when the Israeli warplanes are flying above Damascus. Ahmed al-Shara government cannot present itself as a fulfilling basic function of a government, namely providing security and safety to its people. Hence, Shara's government is sort of on the hunt of any force which will be willing and able to limit Israeli encroachments, and that's the crucial thing for them. Both, and I've mentioned the air domain. The other aspect is the land domain. Let's not forget that Israel captured a number of territories in the south of Syria, and they're actively supporting Druze insurgents in the Suwaida province, which is also in the south of the country. And Syrian government is looking for some force which may limit Israeli land incursions into that area, and which may somehow serve as a peacekeeping force in the south, limiting that.
Well, now, Ahmed al-Shara is actually doing the smart thing. He's not just saying, oh, please help us, you're our only hope of survival. He's actually bargaining with Russia because he knows that in exchange for being able to keep all those military facilities, in the Tartus and the Khmeimim, the Syrian government can actually ask for something in exchange, like, for example, supplies of fuel. Do you think that Russia, at this stage, will be willing and able to fulfill those requests, given that it is tied up militarily in Ukraine, but also that it is actually encountering more and more of an issue with the availability of fuel on its domestic market. I mean, recently it has even, there were rumors that they will have to import gasoline from abroad due to the number of refineries which are damaged or otherwise unable to operate. So this might sound like a good deal for both sides until you factor in, the simple fact that Moscow might actually not be able to fulfill it, at least not to the extent that it would like to. What do you make of that situation?
Well, Syria and Bashar's government, they don't have too many cards to play. And as you've noticed, they have some points of pressure for Russia, and these are those two bases. I mean, Russia is placed in more physical locations in Syria than those two bases which we've described, but those are two large installations. The question of Russia's ability to deliver oil and oil-related products, refined products, is the open question. But it's beyond Syrian perception. If Russia won't be able to deliver oil and petrol, they may deliver at least some degree of military support. The other issue, which we didn't touch upon yet, is the printing of Syrian pound, which is happening still in Moscow. And early ideas of new government were to shift the monetary, production, the printing of Syrian pound to some other location. But it seems that they agreed on keeping that. The other point, which is of the relationship, which is sort of a tricky one, is the fate of Bashar al-Assad. Namely, from time to time we have some rumors that Bashar al-Assad has been poisoned in Moscow, and I think that this the fate of the late president is sort of a pressure point which Russians have on Syria. Obviously, president is widely unpopular, but after 1 or 2 or 3 years, looking into long, in a longer perspective, Bashar al-Assad's family may think about coming back and creating a sort of political opposition then. So there is a lot of areas where both sides may pressure themselves. Well, we may also just when we move towards the familial relationship, we may just mention that, well, in al-Shara family, his brother is also married to a Russian citizen. So the ties and links are numerous.
So there's great complexity there. I've got one question, because we're actually running out of time. I would still like to touch upon one thing. Where is the West in all this? Because initially, this might have seemed like the perfect situation. Russia being pushed out of Syria, so the West could actually, get rid of a threat to the Mediterranean. All of a sudden, Russia is actually staying. Did Western countries actually forget about Syria? Were they not able to offer anything better so that, Syria is looking towards Russia once again for security?
Well, that is the crucial point when we think about that relationship. The future of the Syrian-Russia relationship lies in the hands of Western powers and in the hands of the Arab states and Turkey. Namely, if for European capitals, the Syrian file will become more important than it is right now, if those powers will be able to offer what Syrian government looks for, Syrian government will pursue the better deal. But that would mean that Syria should move up into the agenda of foreign policy agenda of European capitals and Washington, D.C. Think about petrol and refined products. The Syrian consumption is quite limited, and they may be provided by the Arab partners of Syria. Think about, let's say, military umbrella or let's say sort of agreement against Israeli incursion. It may be done with the help of Washington. So there is a number of issues which may be resolved in those bilateral relationships with the other partners, much more powerful, much more potent. But thinking from a Syrian perspective, keeping open relations with Russia is a sort of a pressure or a strategy to somehow remind them, the Western capitals, the Arab capitals, that Syria has some alternative. It's not as good as those other alternatives, but it is, and it may work good enough for Syrian government.
So let's hope the Western capitals are listening. For the time being, Łukasz Federek was our guest today here on Eastern Express. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much for having me.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russian fuel rationing has now reached the Tyumen and Sverdlovsk regions. The Kremlin insists there is no crisis, but drones and closed pumps suggest otherwise.
Gasoline restrictions are spreading across Russia, now hitting the Tyumen and Sverdlovsk regions, following limits imposed earlier in Crimea and Chelyabinsk. Local stations are capping sales at 30 liters per customer, banning fuel in canisters and in some cases running dry. While officials deny shortages, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak recently admitted to a, quote, small deficit of petroleum products. The drop comes as Ukraine intensifies drone strikes on Russian refineries, with at least 16 hit since August. Local media report over 360 gas stations stopped selling fuel between late July and September. In occupied Crimea, nearly half of the stations have no gasoline at all. Meanwhile, Kyiv is urging Western allies to tighten energy sanctions, hoping to choke Moscow's war chest at its source.
The World Bank has slashed Russia's growth outlook. It says the country is drifting into long-term stagnation, not a controlled slowdown.
Russia's economy is on track for just 0.9% growth in 2025, with output barely rising above 1% annually through 2028, according to the World Bank. The lender blames falling oil prices, high interest rates, shrinking investment, and a persistent labor shortage. While the Kremlin projects a modest recovery, business leaders are skeptical. The head of Russia's top industrial union, Alexander Shokhin, calls it, quote, neither soft nor controlled. Defense-linked industries continue to expand, but civilian sectors are in decline. CMACP estimates show non-military production has fallen 5.4% this year, leaving one-third of real sector companies under serious stress. Budget deficits are expected to stay near 3% of GDP, with limited fiscal tools left to revive private demand.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.